All right, everyone, looks like we have another exciting update to Adobe Muse to talk about, and that's the 2015.2 update that just came out. It's honestly more significant than I thought it was going to be. There are some features in here that are going to save you a lot of time, some significant stuff. So let's get started. I'm going to walk you through everything one feature at a time. The first thing you'll notice right off the bat is that Adobe Muse now has the same welcome screen as the rest of the Creative Suite. Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. They all have this nice welcome screen where it's easy to open a recent document or start a new document. And if I open up one of my recent documents here, the next thing that you'll see is that they've made a small change to this screen here, the plan view, and that's that you can do this horizontal layout, this horizontal sort of flow chart, or now you can switch to a vertical view. And the vertical view is going to be really awesome for people who have a ton of pages because you can scroll through them top to bottom, and that hierarchy might not be very deep left to right, but it might be very long top to bottom. So this might be a way that you prefer to scroll through your content if you have a large website. Next up, for those of you who have been using the responsive features in Adobe Muse, you've probably noticed by now that images can be responsive width and height, but rectangles only allow you to choose responsive width, which can be frustrating because then you just end up squishing and squashing your rectangles, and they don't necessarily scale proportionally. So now finally in this update, you can select your rectangles, you can go up to the resize options, and now, boom, you can choose responsive width and height. And with that, if we preview in the browser, as I make things smaller or larger, things scale proportionally. So we can finally make our rectangles, with or without image fills, behave the same way that we've been able to do with images alone. Now this feature, in my opinion, is a really big deal. The vertical move handle. And this really saves a ton of time if you have long web pages. For some of you who don't have long web pages, it's not a big deal. But let's say we've got this page here that has product after product after product, and it just keeps going and going and going. If I need to add a new product here, for instance, or a new row here, you can now select an object, any object. You don't have to create a guide or anything. And when you have that object selected, we've got a new handle on the left-hand side, and we can click and drag to move everything from there down. We can move it from there down up, or we can move it from there down down, if that makes any sense. And we don't have to select any objects to do so. Previously, I would have to zoom out, select a bunch of objects, and scoot them down. And especially when editing museresources.com, which is full of stuff, very long pages, it would be a big pain in the neck for me to add something. So this feature is absolutely huge. It works on any selected object. And it also works on guides. So if you wanted to, you could create a guide, and at any time you can grab that guide and click and drag up or down. This will allow you to create sort of a margin between the area that you're trying to scoot down and the area that you were anchoring with your cursor as you decide to scoot it. So guides and objects, anything you want, that handle shows up, boom, click and drag it down. Huge time saver. This next one solves a really big pain point for Adobe Illustrator users, and that's that you can finally drag and drop and place an Illustrator file directly into Adobe Muse. Whereas before you were likely to copy and paste a graphic from Illustrator into Muse, which would create an SVG, which was cool and everything, but if you wanted to edit it, if you go over and try to edit, there's no option to edit that pasted SVG in Illustrator or any other application for that matter. It's essentially uneditable. You'd have to go back, copy and paste it again. So now finally, and let me go over to this master page here, I can click and drag a .ai file, drop it on my page, click and drag to place it just like any other graphic, and it will automatically generate an SVG. And if I preview this in the browser, it's going to look just like, essentially it looks just like a PNG, but it is an SVG. It supports the gradient, supports all the colors and everything, and it looks really good, and it'll automatically also create an SVG as a fallback in case the browser doesn't support SVG graphics. So it's really doing a lot of work for us on the fly, and all we had to do was drop in an AI file. And really the best part is, with that AI file selected, I can go over to the Assets panel, I can click, and I can choose to edit the original, which will open up in Illustrator. I can make that change in Illustrator, and then whatever I change here, when I hit Save and go back to Adobe Muse, that update will take place, and I end up with my modified asset without having to round trip with another place action, with another save action, with another copy and paste action. It's just done. Now finally, for those of you who have been trying to create circles and instead have created rectangles or squares and then rounded the corners, there is now an ellipse tool, and if you click and hold on the rectangle tool, you'll find that ellipse tool and you can click and drag to create an ellipse, or hold shift when you click and drag to create a circle. Now don't be alarmed if you're creating your circle and all you see is a square. It's because you're seeing the bounding box around the circle and you may not have a fill or a stroke yet. So I'll go over to fill, I'll give it a color, and boom, there's the circle. It's not too late if you've made a circle to turn it into an ellipse or vice versa. It's completely manipulatable and it's essentially vector because it's being created using CSS and not raster pixels, so it'll always scale really nicely. There is also one more new tool on the toolbar over on the left-hand side, and that's the image frame tool, which you've got a rectangle tool and an ellipse tool to choose from. But either one, it allows you to click and drag an image placeholder frame, which you can then click and drag an image into, and it will automatically place it to fill that entire frame. So if I click and drag this image here, just click inside of that frame, it'll automatically place the image to fill that frame. And when I now click and drag the image, it's automatically going to constrain the proportions as if that's an image, not as if it's a rectangle. If you do want to change the size of the rectangle, you can hold the Command key when you click and drag, and as you click and drag, the image won't necessarily react. In fact, it won't react. So as I click and drag, if I change my mind about how I want this image to fit inside the rectangle, there are a couple of really important keyboard shortcuts to know, and these have been around forever. It's Shift and then Option or Alt, depending on whether you're on a Mac or a PC, along with the Command or Control key, depending on whether or not you're on a PC. So for Mac, Shift, Option, Command. If you're on a PC, Shift, Alt, Control. And the letter E if you want to see the entire image centered in the frame, or C if you want to crop the image to fill the entire frame. E for entire image, C for crop the image. Pretty useful, and that frame tool is definitely going to save a lot of time for those of you who are sort of wireframing your website before you start building it out. This next one is for all you disorganized little monkeys out there who are dragging in assets from all over the frickin' place and not keeping track of where things are stored on your hard drive. So if you've got assets from all over the place and you are risking losing them because some are on your desktop, some are in Dropbox, some maybe came from an email, you can now finally consolidate all those assets into one place. You can collect those assets. So there's a new button at the bottom of the Assets panel. You can click on that to automatically copy all of the assets in your document into one folder and get them all linked up to the Assets panel from that one folder. So you can also do it on an asset by asset basis. So if you've got one misplaced, you can just do a right click over there and you can choose to collect that one asset into a folder of your choice. So a really good way to stay organized for those of you who up until this point have refused to stay organized. This next one is a really big deal, and for some of you this is going to be the biggest feature. People have been asking, where did my scroll effects go? When the responsive update came out for Adobe Muse, if you created a responsive site, which, I mean, you could choose not to, but if you did create a responsive website, a website that has multiple breakpoints, you could not use scroll effects anymore. And that was a big bummer, and they are back. But there's one condition: your breakpoint where you're adding the scroll effects must be fixed with. It can't be a fluid width breakpoint. So let's say I've got a couple of breakpoints here. Let me add another one. You'll notice that on the breakpoints bar, there is a little symbol here with a box with two arrows sticking out of it. That means it's fluid. That means it's not going to work with scroll effects. That means it's elastic, and as the browser gets smaller and larger, it's going to follow the browser getting smaller and larger. That's not going to work with scroll effects. But you can double click on the breakpoint and you can switch it from fluid width to fixed width. You can still have multiple breakpoints. You may have to rearrange things a little bit. You can still have multiple breakpoints, but if you'd like to add scroll effects to one of them, it must be a fixed width breakpoint. And look, all of these things come back. How exciting is that? So you may want to do a fixed width desktop site and have it switch to a fluid width tablet and mobile site, because tablet and mobile aren't very friendly with the scroll effects in the first place, and you get that flexibility again. You get to decide. It's not going to decide for you. The next feature is a big improvement for those of you who are using CC libraries, especially to store colors, where previously, in the previous version, colors weren't very friendly. It didn't allow us to add our colors to our swatches. It didn't allow us to choose if we wanted to do a fill or a stroke. So now, finally, if you have an object selected and you click, by default, it will set the color as a fill. If it is a text box, it'll still set the color as a fill. But if you do a right click, this is what's new, you do a right click, you can choose to do a fill color or a stroke color. And if you have text highlighted, it will automatically do the text color instead. So let's go over to this box here. I can choose the black with a right click and choose set stroke color. And even though there wasn't a stroke in the first place, it automatically added one using that color. And the next big thing is I can even select multiple colors here. I could select all of these colors, and I can right click and choose to add them to my swatches. By using the shift key, I was able to highlight all of them. Now you might be wondering, why would I want to add them to my swatches when I have them over here in this library? The reason, it's a little complicated, but let me show one example here where I duplicate this box. They both have this color black applied. And if they both have the same swatch from our swatches up here applied, let me apply this gray, for example. I'm now going to select one of them, just one of them, not the other one. The only thing that they have in common is that I've used the same swatch from my choices of swatches here. Now, if I change the color, it's only going to change the color of one of them. But if I get, say, a call from the client, and they say, you know, that gray color, can we make it a darker shade of gray? It looks a little bit too light on my computer screen. You might say, okay, let's make it a little lighter and see what you think, or make it a little darker and see what you think. And when you do that using the swatch, by double-clicking on the swatch, it changes everything, text, strokes, fills, everything that's connected to that swatch. So you'll notice both of these changed, even though I did not have them both selected. It works for text, too. If I go and I set the text color here to that same swatch, and it's that dark gray, they might call me on the phone and they might say, you know, we're not using that dark gray color anymore. We're now using a dark blue. So I can go in, double click that dark gray swatch, and the only thing that I have selected right now is the text. But if I go in and change the swatch itself and I make that a dark blue color, it's automatically going to change those boxes too. Anything that's connected to that swatch is going to change at the same time. So now finally, even though CC libraries can't do that, I can quickly select and add my CC library swatch colors into the Adobe Muse swatches so I can take advantage of those features. The next feature is just a little guide, but for those of you who have been wondering why you can't just go up to the breakpoint bar and just change the minimum width by dragging it just like you can with your other breakpoints, you can now click and drag to change the minimum page width of the page. You don't have to go into the breakpoint settings and change the minimum page width here. And that's going to have a different effect on fluid versus static breakpoints, or fluid versus fixed rather. But now you can do it just by clicking and dragging. So that's pretty cool. Next up is a feature that's only going to be important to you if you've had a problem with previewing your site on your computer. But if you have, you can now go to the Adobe Muse Preferences, and now in the Adobe Muse Preferences there is an option to change the preview network address. So if you're having an issue with your IP address, you can now switch it either from automatic to localhost to this reserved IP address, which may or may not create a conflict on your computer. So if it does, you can switch it. But if you're not having a problem, this probably will not do anything for you. In fact, I can't even recommend changing it or playing with it unless you've had a specific problem with your previews not loading when you go to preview in the browser. Last but not least, some technical improvements have been made under the hood to Adobe Muse, one of which is that if you have a sticky footer on a page that is not as tall as the browser and you want the footer to go to the bottom, the sticky footer feature has been around for a while, but now instead of using JavaScript, it'll use CSS, which performs a little bit better. And also, JavaScript will load asynchronously. That's going to improve page load times. It's going to improve how you look to Google. And most importantly, your images, CSS files, JavaScript files will now be cached by the browser, which means if you go to a website and you go from page to page, say you create a website, someone visits your website, goes from page to page, finds the same images on multiple pages, finds the same CSS files on multiple pages, it's not going to load them over and over again from the web. And Google is also not going to load them over and over again when it scans your website and measures you for performance. It's now only going to load something if it hasn't already been loaded. It'll otherwise be cached or saved in the browser so that it doesn't have to get loaded over and over and over again if it's the same thing. Another improvement that's been made, which personally I recommend because for the sake of the user experience, you probably want things to load as quickly as possible, and web fonts might be slowing you down. So now, if you're using a lot of fancy web fonts and you're waiting for them to load and the page is loading slowly, what you can do is you could choose to go to File, Site Properties, and on the Advanced tab of the Site Properties, you can now choose to load pages faster using fallback fonts. meaning if you're using a sans serif font, it'll load a generic sans serif font until it has a chance to load the font that you chose, the web font that you chose. Maybe it's an Edge font or a Typekit font. And then it will load that font when it has a chance to. But the bottom line is the text will appear and become readable before that happens. For those of you who are most concerned with design and you're most concerned with the website looking like it's loading properly, you may not want to turn this on. The difference is you're not going to see anything until you see the right thing versus you're going to see the wrong font so that people can begin reading and seeing the content, and then it will switch to the right font when it's done loading. Having this turned on will do the latter of the two things. It'll load the page using the wrong font, but a font nonetheless, and then when the site has a chance to fully load, it'll switch automatically. So really that does it. That's all of what's new in Adobe Muse 2015.2. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe if you haven't already, and head over to museresources.com and download all the cool stuff that I've made. I've got, I've got a few widgets lined up. So for those of you who keep an eye on museresources.com, you're going to see a few new widgets showing up over the next couple of weeks. All right, guys. See you soon.